Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Harmony Foundation podcast or webinar series. My name is Christy Weeks, and I'm with Harmony Foundation. I'm the digital media manager, and we want to thank you for joining us for today's presentation. The evolution of modern medicine has made the spiritual foundation of 12-step recovery obsolete, fact or fiction, which is presented by Dr. James Boone, the medical director for La Hacienda Treatment Center. Harmony Foundation is nestled on a 43-acre campus in the Rocky Mountains, just outside of Estes Park, Colorado. Our Colorado residential rehab offers comprehensive treatment for adults and their family members. Who is Harmony Foundation? So our why factor is that we believe that long-term recovery from alcohol and other drugs is possible. And so as a place between two worlds, our location in the Rockies provides a safe and quiet respite from the pain of addiction. With over 50 years of treating addiction, we have fostered a generation of long-term recovery who supports our clients and families for a lifetime. Our staff at all levels of the organization work together to create a community of recovery support that is long-lasting. So we are a 70-bed residential treatment program. We have also recently just opened 2 IOP programs, one weekend, which occurs on campus, and we will soon be opening another IOP daytime program in Fort Collins, Colorado. We offer an evidence-based 12-step program that is gender responsive. And if you're looking to learn more about Harmony Foundation, you can visit us at harmonyfoundationinc.com or contact our admissions staff at 866-686-7867. Just a few housekeeping rules as we roll through today's presentation. We want you to know that you must be actively engaged in the presentation for at least 45 minutes in order to receive a CEU certificate. We use a system that tracks how long people are engaged in the program, so anything less than 45 minutes would not qualify for a certificate through NADAC for CEUs. However, we can provide an attendance certificate if you need to jump off early. So I think I have a screen share problem. Let's see if I can fix this. Let's see here. Can everybody see? Can we see that screen share? Is that better? Anybody has a chat box they want to drop into? Let's see. Better now. Yay. Sorry about that. So many little buttons I get, they hide on me. So as I was saying, for the certificate, you must be on for 45 minutes. You will receive your certificate by end of day Friday. And if you do not, please, I am having a terrible time here. Please go ahead and give me, for the love of Pete, I can't get there we go. It feels like a Monday, but I think it's Wednesday. So if you don't receive your certificate, give me a quick email, cweeks@harmonyfoundationinc.com, and I will certainly take a look at that for you. We do record these webinars, so if you would like to access this information again, you will be able to find it on our website underneath the professional tab in the archived webinars section. You will not only find this webinar, but you will also find all of our other webinars previously that we have hosted. So that should be up by end of day Friday as well. So Dr. Boone will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. You can type them into your chat box. We'll kind of keep track of them and get them addressed at the end. And so I'd really like to take this time to thank La Hacienda Treatment Center for loaning us Dr. Boone for this hour. If you would like more information about them, please check out their website, www.lahacienda.com, or email me with any questions. I can see what I can track down for you. So Introducing our presenter today, Dr. James Boone has served at La Hacienda Treatment Center since 2004. He graduated with honors in 1984 from Southwestern Medical School in Dallas and did his internal medicine internship and residency at Baylor University Medical Center. He earned his board certification in internal medicine in 1987 and began his career in his family's private practice in Pasadena, Texas. In 2004, he joined Dan Boone in the full-time practice of addiction medicine in Hunt. A member of the American Society of Addiction Medicine, he is board certified in addiction medicine. He and Ruth have 6 children. He is an avid fisherman and is active in his church. He has a passion for helping persons with addiction experience the fullness of drug and alcohol-free life through an active 12-step recovery. So at this point, I'm going to step out of this and turn everything over to Dr. Boone and let him get started. I apologize for all the slip-ups today. It seems to be one of those days. Here we go. Dr. Boone, I'm turning it to you.
Christy, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, excellent. Can you see my screen?
I have to get out of mine to see your screen. I do not see your screen.
How about?
Aha. He has, it says you have started your screen share. I do not see your slideshow.
Okay, let's see here. I just had that.
There we go.
You good?
Yes.
Okay. Hey, welcome everybody. Thanks for taking your time to join me. As Christy said, just have been working at La Hacienda for a long time. I was a kid that had a pretty amazing life. Born and raised in Africa. I was this little guy right here in the middle of the screen back in 1963, where I grew up, went to high school, came back, married a sweet lady I've been married to for almost 39 years, 6 kids, 14 grandbabies, just a busy, hardworking guy. Take care of patients all day, like a lot of you folks, but really just kind of have a passion to help people sort of achieve that recovered life. So I'm just going to kind of cover a lot of information to start with, and then kind of get back to the meat of the matter. So obviously sort of familiar information to you guys, but there's still a couple of things that I like about this, just that addiction sort of, definition of that relapsing cycle, intoxication, binging, withdrawal. But what I want to just kind of focus on a little bit is that second thing, impairment of mechanisms involved in reward from natural processes leads to impulsive and compulsive and addictive behaviors. This trait, plus or minus stress, leads to this hypodopaminergic state. So I kind of love Nora Volkow, head of NIDA, that just talks about the reward deficiency syndrome, that for me, without any family history of addiction in my own life, on either side of my family, none of my siblings, none of my 6 kids, the way that my reward pathway is built is that I probably have a relatively hypersensitive dopaminergic state in that reward pathway, as opposed to the patients that we deal with on a regular basis. So we know, right, and I'm going to just, not burn too much old information, but all the drugs of addiction work in that reward pathway, ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens. And then we have this constant feedback to our prefrontal cortex. And really the prefrontal cortex is more complex, and I'll talk about this here in just a second. but that prefrontal cortex has that constant interaction. Sort of simplistically, when I'm talking to patients about that reward pathway in prefrontal cortex, it's that constant feedback that all of us have every day, where the reward pathway is that sort of guttural, sort of visceral thing of, gosh, I'd love to, I probably need to. Hey, I want to skip work and go play. I probably need to. Hey, I want to eat that. I probably should walk away. So it's that constant sort of feedback and interplay of our prefrontal cortex that really kind of helps to regulate that. So just the initial, the study from the late 60s that was so profound in addiction medicine. And, just very, very, very briefly, right, if animals explore perimeters of cages, right, so ranchers check their fence lines, dogs in your backyard run the line. And so that initial study of mouse in a cage, and as the mouse explores the perimeter, this bar is low enough and wide enough that the mouse doesn't walk around it or jump over it, but steps on that. And every time they step on that, they get intravenous that through an IV pump. And if you put blood pressure medicines, diabetes medicines, anything that patients never abuse in there, the mouse doesn't either, doesn't care and ignores it. But if I put pure alcohol in that, then every time this mouse steps on that mouse gets pure IV alcohol when he steps on the bar. That mouse acts like my patients, just loves to hang out the bar, gets drunk all the time, gets a snack, and then runs back, stays at the bar, kind of getting intoxicated. So that initial study that was done that looked at, all the classic drugs of cocaine and heroin and meth and cannabis, and that mouse loved that stuff and hung out here. Very profound with coke and meth, right, where the mouse actually, in the initial study, it was only an 18-inch walk from the bar to the water source and food source. And with IV cocaine or IV meth, these mice would actually die at the foot of the bar, wouldn't walk away and drink water, eat food. The rat park study that was re-explored in a really well done TED Talk and book recently, sort of, is everything we know about addiction wrong? And if you have this great social structure with unlimited little toys and sexual partners and all that stuff, that the mouse doesn't always choose the drug, and sort of challenge, hey, do we have this wrong? And is it all social construct? But unfortunately, we don't live in rat Disney World, right? I mean, there's cancer and there's house fires and there's deaths, and certainly that social construct is important. And I know that I've heard so often in coming out of the AA rooms, that concept of I get drunk, we stay sober. So I don't see that study as being sort of profoundly changing in sort of what we talk about. But anyway, we know this was sort of foundational and hallmark in addiction medicine. And for me, there were three levels. One, it first let us identify that there are substances that reinforce animal behavior or are quote unquote addictive. The second thing was the power of those substances when those animals actually quit eating and drinking. When I give this, when I give some of this information to my patients, it's not uncommon that a patient will raise their hand and go, hey, Dr. Boone, I did IV coke and meth and still got some to eat and drink. And I'm like, yeah, that's really great. You're smarter than a mouse. That's really awesome. But seriously, is that, you also were on westbound I-10 going east when you were in a blackout with alcohol and some Xanax, or you buried a girlfriend with heroin when you're still using. I mean, it was just sort of the depth of just sort of addiction itself. Now, when we look at that whole concept of addiction, and this is a really complicated slide, and don't get sort of caught up and lost, but I just want to sort of point out a few things. When we get into the human brain, we have this very highly developed frontal lobe where all of our complex personality and individuality are, but these prefrontal cortical structures are in green. And these prefrontal cortical structures, if you actually look at how that regulates that whole sort of problem that goes on when we have drug, alcohol exposure, things that are powerful stimuli in our reward pathway. Sort of these different, and all these different names: angular, singular, cortex, dorsolateral, prefrontal, ventrolateral, prefrontal, olfactory, frontal, ventromedial. But just kind of look at a few of the smaller things. So that craving phenomenon is experienced up here in the very top portion. And that's where also sort of the value of the stimulus, and where we first start to weigh sort of what is the cost, what is the value, what is this going to cost me? Anticipation, availability, and then as we get into the lower sections, action inhibition, emotional control, where we're able to go, gosh, I would love to do this, but what is the actual risk of that? And then I'm able to further assess sort of the outcome valuation, the value of the drug, and be able to go, okay, so gosh, a six-pack versus my marriage, really? I'm not doing that. That doesn't make any sense. That whole process is played out in that area of the prefrontal cortex. So that sort of led to the Goldstein Vocal study, where the whole sort of presentation of this definition of impaired response inhibition and salience attribution, that really when you look at what happens with addiction, when you look at what happens with our patients with drug and alcohol, and potentially even looking at some of the process addictions, potentially even if you look at sex and or gambling or whatever, but really going to focus on substances. And when you just read this, and I'm sure that a lot of you in the audience are familiar, but I think it's really profound. Just if you kind of sound that out and look at that: impaired response inhibition and salience attribution. So when you have the concept of, gosh, I wonder what that would be like, for me, without any addiction, I'm able to look at my response and I'm able to inhibit that and go, that's a terrible decision. And then also salience attribution, right? How important is this? Is that I'm able to look at that and go, in reality, the importance of this potential use of cocaine in this bar is not nearly as important as the relationship with my kids, with my wife, with my job. And my salience attribution is not impaired. And that's what we see in patients who are struggling with addiction. So this excessive salience to the drug or drug-related cues decrease sensitivity to non-drug reinforcers, my family, my job, my relationships, my legal entanglements, whatever. And then that decreased ability to inhibit those behaviors. And that is this impaired response inhibition, salience attribution, that is really hallmark from an addiction. It really is a great way to define that. So if we look at that role of the prefrontal cortex in this condition, there's both direct response to drug and drug-related cues, response to the non-drug rewards, money, family, job, et cetera. That higher executive function, my ability to make good decisions, including this inhibitory control. And then that's the part of my brain that allows me to have awareness, that the whole concept that I'm aware of this condition. So I'm an internal medicine doc, an addiction medicine doc, and years ago, I've been in full-time addiction medicine for almost 16 years, but as a busy internal medicine doc, taking care of people with different strokes. And if I damage a certain hemisphere of my brain, that stroke patient becomes unaware of that side of their body. So potentially, their arm is sitting on their chest and they throw the arm off on that stroke affected side. And like, this person keeps putting their hand on me. They're not aware of that side of their body. And that is the part of our brain that allows us to have awareness of that quote unquote illness. So with our patients, when they're telling me the things that they've given up or the risk, for me without addiction, right, I'm like, this makes no sense. I mean, the concept, you're at risk for that. And the concept that anybody would ever get a third DWI and go to prison it makes no sense. But again, it takes that part of the prefrontal cortex to even be aware of the illness itself. Now, non-drug rewards. So if we look at functional MRI, right? So functional MRI, SPECT scanning, SPECT, those things actually look at functionality of the brain. And in functional MRI, in a state of craving, intoxication, withdrawal, early abstinence, sensitivity of the prefrontal cortex to non-drug rewards, money, family, etc., markedly attenuated compared with that of healthy non-addicted controls. Their ability to actually recognize the importance of that, to see that part of my brain that becomes active as I make that decision, impaired. Functional MRI in cocaine addicted individuals reduced signal in the left olfactory cortex for high gain. 50% of cocaine addicted individuals rated the same value of all monetary amounts between $10 and $1,000. I was talking to a guy that had used cocaine. Wait, Dr. Moon, so wait, if I could get $1,000, I could get more cocaine. I think I would know that. I'm like, no, you're thinking of cocaine. What I'm talking about is you're willing to risk that potential $1,000 of what you lose with your job, and you're able to minimize that. You can't understand and see and evaluate that. And that's because of that part of the prefrontal cortex. Medial prefrontal cortex, subjective value signals for goal-directed decision-making, the attribution of salience, that ability, again, for me to look at goals, for me to look at the importance of that particular compound. Emotional reactivity and disease awareness. So that is the part of my brain, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that's hyperactive during emotional processing of negative emotions. Hypoactivation of this anterior cingulate further reduced sensitivity to negative reinforcers, right? What we talk about, adverse consequences don't typically change behaviors in our patients. That capacity for insight into the disease, again, dependent on a healthy prefrontal cortex. So really, it's prefrontal cortex. I mean, that's what's kind of damaged. So several years ago, when I was kind of studying and just kind of randomly and doing, looking, sort of searching PubMed, I was looking at if it's prefrontal cortex. I was kind of like, hey, has anybody looked at the neurobiology of wisdom? Can we not your IQ, not what your GPA is, but those people that are wise, like where does wisdom come from? So there's actually a very well done, fun to look up. You can get it for free if you just Google it and look it up. But this review article by these two authors, Meeks and Jost. So the neurobiology of wisdom. And so what they first had to do was to define wisdom. Like, how do you define it? And so they went through multiple different cultures and to try to come up with how would we, if we're going to explore the brains of people who are, quote, wise, first we have to define what is wise. And this is what they came up with. Number one, pro-social attitudes and behaviors. Not pro-social like social like happy hour. Pro-social like what is good for my community, for my family, the social construct, right? So pro-social attitudes, and then social decision-making, a pragmatic knowledge of life. Emotional homeostasis, not, every little thing that comes up, they don't sort of melt down and blow up and get, there's this depth of calmness, reflection, self-understanding, value relativism and tolerance, that ability to recognize that there's a lot of things in life that are pretty small, and I can go through and deal with those things. Acknowledgement of and dealing effectively with uncertainty and ambiguity. Now, the reason it's a little random, the reason I put this slide in here for two reasons, but one is I've done full-time addiction medicine now for, as I said, almost 16 years. And if I look at my patients during that, either when they're active in their substance use disorder, and I look at their behaviors, it is the total opposite of wise, right? I mean, Pro-social attitudes? No. So self-decision, so self-aware, so self-centered and so absorbed. Social decision-making? Absolutely not. It's all about me. Emotional homeostasis? The opposite. Everything is a big deal. Everything is this, just hardly sort of stable emotionally. Reflection, value, tolerance, uncertainty, ambiguity. It's the exact opposite, right? So Meeks and Jost go through and sort of like, where does this come from? And when they looked at neuroanatomy and neurobiology and looked at actual, with technological advances, with functional MRI and SPECT, just the different imaging techniques we now have, right? They're able to look and so that it's healthy prefrontal cortical activity, especially dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that plays a role in emotional regulation, decision-making, top-down regulation of that. So I'm not controlled by my emotional desires and or wants. I'm able to look at this in the big scheme. Lateral prefrontal cortex, calculated reason-based decision-making. Medial prefrontal cortex, emotional valence, pro-social attitudes. And then just from a mood, that healthy serotonergic, dopaminergic activity, that's influenced when I have strong family histories of depression, et cetera, the whole kind of concept of the genetic polymorphisms that maybe increase my risk of addiction. So bottom line, right, my patients come in, their prefrontal cortex sort of structurally looks like this, and I want this. So from a body standpoint, right, if my body looks like this, there's things I can do that will make me healthier. If I jack up my shoulder throwing a baseball, or I have to have surgery on my shoulder or on my elbow, I'm going to meet with an OT, PT person, and they're going to start to rehab my shoulder. They're going to start to rehab my elbow, whatever that is. And I'm going to do specific work to strengthen that part of my body. So if I look at patients, if I look at wisdom and it comes from the prefrontal cortex, if I look at the opposite and look where emotional control, salience attribution, the whole complex of that, that whole construct of that impaired prefrontal cortex, then really, what then can I do? Are there specific things that I can do to make my prefrontal cortex better? Love this quote. We begin to realize that it will take something more powerful than we are to relieve our suffering. This is what we've been missing all along, a source of hope. So I know there's more than one ways to, more than one way to kind of skin a cat. There's more than one ways to get to anywhere. But the 12 steps, if you look at the foundation of 12-step recovery, it's this spiritual foundation. And when we look at prefrontal cortical structures, there's a lot of fascinating data. So I'm just going to go over some just interesting. I'm going to cover a fair amount of sort of territory. And so neuroanatomical correlates of religiosity and spirituality, Lisa Miller et al. Functional neuroimaging during religious recitations in self-identified spiritual subjects showed strong activation of the frontal parietal circuit, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, dorsomedial frontal and medial parietal cortex, specific activation of that part of our brain. So we think about neuroplasticity, that ability for our brains to change, then just like if you're developing a musical ear or whatever that is, when we utilize that part of the brain, we're able to lay down, reinforce different tracks, and essentially strengthen that area. Beauregard et al. Functional MRI studies of Carmelite nuns during a mystical experience revealed significant activation in multiple areas of the prefrontal cortex. If anybody's ever been in an MRI unit and how noisy those things are, number one, I'm highly impressed that you can actually have meditation and a mystical experience actively engaged in a functional MRI. But again, a fascinating study. Subject who confirmed a strong importance of religion or spirituality demonstrated thicker cortices in the left and right parietal, occipital, mesofrontal lobes where our prefrontal cortex lives. If we do volumetric MRI and we actually measure structures, measure sizes, another study I don't have quoted here that looked at volumetric MRI on nuns and Buddhist monks, and the prefrontal cortex volume was significantly greater than the general population. Again, that importance from a spirituality standpoint. Spiritual Practices by Andrew Newberg, really fascinating author if you guys ever want to just kind of read about some of the guys that have done most of the study. But cerebral blood flow during meditative prayer in the prefrontal cortex increases by 7.1%. Inferior parietal 6.8, inferior frontal lobe by 9%. That's the part of our brain that is being actively engaged, actively being utilized, actively being stimulated. Other things, decreases in heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, oxygen consumption, other sort of health benefits that go with that. Lazar article, meditation experience associated with increased cortical thickness. 20 participants with extensive insight meditation experience showed thicker cortices compared with matched controls, predominantly prefrontal cortex, right anterior insula. Again, strengthening that part of our brain. Another Miller study, spirituality, religiosity, and depression. An older study, 2012, right? But pretty fascinating. Religion or spirituality confers a neuroanatomical resilience in those predisposed to developing depressive illness. So a 10-year prospective study of offspring of depressed and non-depressed parents. So we know that if you have a family history of depression, your risk of depression is significantly greater. So track for 10 years, offspring who reported that religion or spirituality was highly important had 1/4 the risk of developing major depression in the whole population. And if you looked at high-risk offspring with one or more parent with major depression, they had 1/10 the risk of developing major depression. Just interesting, fascinating. Maria et al., 2006, huge study, meta-analysis of 98,975 patients. Spirituality robustly associated with lower levels of depressive symptoms. The CASA study, substance abuse, religion, and spirituality, 2-year study from Columbia. Adults who did not consider religious beliefs important, more than 1.5 times more likely to use alcohol and cigarettes, greater than 3 times more likely to binge drink, 4 times more likely to use illicit drugs other than marijuana, 6 times more likely to use marijuana than adults who believe religion was important. Teens who never attended religious services, 2 times more likely to drink, 3 times more likely to use marijuana and binge drink, 4 times more likely to use illicit drugs. Just, it's robust. I'm not in a pulpit here or something, but I mean, the data is robust and it's interesting. This is an impressive study. Done by Schoen Thaler, NIDA, drug addiction treatment outcome study, relapse as a function of spirituality, religiosity. Incredible retention rates. So 2,947 patients out of 2,966 retained for an entire year during the study. 5 different measures of spirituality, including strength of religious beliefs, religious service attendance, religious books, programs, prayer, and meditation. Percentage who achieved a remission rises significantly as spirituality rises across all 5 measures. A p-value less than 0.0005. Very impressive p-value. Those who attended religious services more than 1 time a week, 16.4% higher remission rates. It's interesting, just impressive to me. So this is going to seem random, so Austin Bradford Hill was the first researcher and doc back in the 50s who first presented data in Europe saying that, hey, smoking causes lung cancer. And so he came up with these 6 different topics, and this has become what's considered the Bradford Hill criteria when you're trying to establish cause and effect of different things. And so when he looked at smoking and lung cancer, if you look at magnitude, more smokers among patients with lung cancer, dose effect, the more you smoke, the higher the risk, consistency, same findings in multiple studies, temporality, smoking preceded lung cancer, plausibility, there are carcinogens in tobacco smoke, specificity, removal of all confounding factors that could explain the finding by correlation and not causation. So on this, if I scratch my head and it thunders, I scratch my head again and it thunders, it's still right, completely unrelated, not causation, with just correlation. So with smoking, he was able to look at that back in 1950. It wasn't until 1965 when the Surgeon General warning came out, but that data varies strong. Again, sort of a funny random slide, but George Wiseman, Vice President Philip Morris, 1954. If we had any thought or knowledge that in any way we were selling a product harmful to consumers, we would stop business tomorrow. They've continued to be, some of y'all's stock is probably with Philip Morris, but anyway, I think it's funny after it was proven to cause cancer. But the reason I talk about Bradford Hill is that if you look at the Bradford Hill criteria and apply that to Alcoholics Anonymous, magnitude of effect, abstinence 2 times higher in AA. Dose response, frequency of attendance correlates with abstinence. Consistency, same results in different groups worldwide. Temporality, prior attendance predicts future abstinence. Plausibility, behavioral and neurobiological explanations we'll talk about here in just a second. Specificity, causation, or correlation, that one you can't really look at. But the Bradford Hill criteria, even if you look at AA, it's interesting and pretty impressive. So I'm going to quote some older studies that you guys are probably familiar with, right? But the Project Match study way back in 98, 3 arms with 12-step facilitation, CBT and MET, motivational enhancement therapy, 12 steps statistically superior when total abstinence the goal. Longabod studies, those with high social support for drinking. High social support for drinking just means that basically all your friends are drinkers. You don't have a social support for non-drinking. Markedly higher success with 12-step approach. Fiorentini, 12-step recovery after treatment, the highest success rates with longer treatment, completion of treatment, and weekly 12-step group attendance. Neurobiology. So neurobiology of successful abstinence. If you look at gray matter volume, so I mentioned that, so these drugs, all of the drugs of abuse actually damage the prefrontal cortex. We had known back to 2007 that they damaged some of the pathways that connected my prefrontal cortex to my reward pathway. So my ability to have that normal impulse control, we know that those pathways take 90 to 120 days to get better. So that's probably the neurobiology behind sort of the tradition in the 12-step community of 90 meetings in 90 days, just that we know that first 90 to 120 days are very high risk. And part of that came from the damaged pathways that connect my prefrontal cortex, my ability to have impulse control. But again, we've also then been able to document that there is direct injury, and you can look at these volumetric MRIs. So I've been at La Hacienda since November of 2004. I've taken care of, I went through the data, I've taken care of over 12,000 different patients. And every month I've got a bunch of patients that are just so smart, just brilliant people. But as a guy that just doesn't like alcohol and haven't used ever other substances, I can look at all of my drinkers, all of my heavy drug users, and no matter how smart they are, I can be like the little annoying 7th grade boy and go, yeah, but my prefrontal cortex is bigger than yours, kind of a deal, But because if I actually look at volumetric MRI, there is damage. And when abstinence takes place, you start to see recovery in gray matter volume. The most rapid recovery occurs during the first 30 days, but you can see continued actual increase in volumetric size of prefrontal cortical structures out to the 9-month mark. Recovery of positron emission tomography measures of brain metabolism within 30 days. Elevated frontal lobe blood flow persists into abstinence and can take approximately 4 years to return to normal. This is a really fascinating thing to me. So as a doc, As a doc, I know that when my body has an injury, an infection, if there's something going on in my body sends more blood to that area for the healing process. If I've got an infection in my arm, if I get a skin infection from a puncture wound or whatever, my arm gets red and hot, and it's red and hot because I have vasodilated vessels to get blood to my skin, right? If you're up all night and working, or you're in an airport or somewhere where they're around a bunch of smoke or whatever, and your eyes are red because your body's trying to send more oxygen to your eyes. You need to get your eyes closed, get away from the smoke, the irritant, right? So the frontal lobe area of our brain, which is where our prefrontal cortex lives, we see continued increased frontal lobe blood flow out to the 4-year mark. So by the 30-day mark, 60, 90-day, our patients look really good. But I always tell them, I go, hey guys, it's going to get better. Your impulse control, your ability to maintain recovery, sobriety. And if I even think about the concept of wisdom that Meeks and Jost present, which is so profound in that prefrontal cortical area, there's continued healing of that out to the 4-year mark. The true thing of abstinence, what we talk about, it's more than just recovery, but it's this increased cognitive control that's needed to maintain sobriety. Again, from recovery of that prefrontal cortex. Near-infrared spectroscopy improved cortical function with cue-based triggers with longer abstinence. Cue-based triggers. So if I show the heroin person a picture of a needle and syringe, and I look at that part of my brain and the activation, the longer they get away, the longer they are 100% abstinent, the less power that cue-based trigger has. I actually did this again. I need to update this slide. Tons of articles, but back early to 2015, I just did a PubMed search, why Alcoholics Anonymous does not work. 0 articles. Now, the anonymity, right, kind of makes research more difficult, but let me just give you some more sort of data on just some fascinating things on 12-step recovery work. So the whole concept of step 1, the whole concept of those first few portions of the step of something bigger than yourself, the concept of looking at that from a neurological standpoint, cognitive dissonance. Those struggling with addiction have conflicting views of themselves as both able and unable to control actions. That result is cognitive dissonance. That thing of like, gosh, I keep trying to do the right stinking thing, and yet I do the other. Accepting powerlessness and calling on a higher power to guide and govern actually relieves that cognitive dissonance. That takes place in the anterior cingulate, which is one of the prefrontal cortical structures. The fellowship of AA and mirror neurons. So mirror neurons are really fascinating. You guys can try this afternoon if you're with a client or a patient. What we do with mirroring is that there is a specific part of our brain that mirrors activity, and it relates to empathy and self-awareness, but we tend to copy the behaviors. So you find yourself, unconsciously kind of using the same facial expressions or hand gestures or whatever. But in my office, it's not uncommon. I'm sitting there talking to a patient, and the patient crosses his arms and leans back in the chair. And the next thing I know, I'm crossing my arms and leaning back in the chair. I'm not mocking them or whatever. It's just try it yourself. You do something specific. It's not uncommon. You'll see the patient kind of mirror that. And that actually does, if you look at humans, it relates to empathy and self-awareness. But again, that's what happens. The whole concept in AA's emphasis on mutuality over self-help, that identification, alignment with the sponsor. Mentalizing, the ability to understand one's own mental state and its relation to another person's mental state, and to see them separate from their behaviors. You are not your disease, right? You are Mary Johnson. You struggle with alcohol use disorder. The alcohol does not define you, right? You are, and we've done that for me as a doc, years ago. I'm in my early 60s. I'm 61 now, but I was first in medical school, one of the guys was like, yeah, and in room 7 is this, diabetic, and in room 8 is an acute MI, and room 9 is a gallbladder. And the physician that was training us was like, oh my gosh, do not ever say that again. Do not call her a gallbladder. She has a name. She is a person, right? That ability to understand and its relationship. This leads to improved empathy and responsivity and less selfish behaviors. Stories of self-disclosure are strongly associated with increased activation in the meso-limbic dopaminergic systems and are actually felt as an alternative reward in the reward pathway. Narratives of self-redemption, right, the whole 12-step community of shared strength and hope, of self-redemption are predictive of behavioral change and improved health. Dunlop published 2 studies revealing a common difference in the narratives of long-term sobriety compared with short-term, and 83% success compared to 44% success with redemptive versus non-redemptive self-narrative. I don't want to hear war stories. Strength and hope, those things actually specifically produce that same thing in my brain in the reward pathway. And if you look at just general health scores, that redemptive group had higher general health scores. When we say stuff out loud to one another, it helps to clarify our thoughts. It broadens accountability. It opens up avenues for help. That spoken word goes through different pathways. So it's totally different when you read something, when you think something, but when you say something out loud, it creates new memories via the amygdala, hippocampal structures. That thing of when I meet with a sponsor, when I share my 5th step with a sponsor, when I help somebody else do their step work, speak out loud. Step 4 followed by step 5 doesn't focus on the chemical, because the chemical is not the problem, right? If the chemical was the problem, they would stop the chemical. The problem is that it's the phenotype. It's this reward deficiency syndrome. So the fact that we're not focusing on the chemical, focusing on other things, help to identify problems and issues. Making amends and helping others as a form of altruism, as you do your 9th step, as you share also as you go further into your 12th step, improves the synthesis and release of oxytocin, which is the human bonding neuropeptide, further improving selflessness and strengthening the bond within families and fellowship. So if you just look at it, right, I mean, there's just a whole lot of different things that come through here that all have to do with our midbrain and prefrontal cortex. Craving and relapse, those midbrain dopamine levels, but that suppression in the prefrontal cortex, mirroring in the inferior frontal cortex, mentalizing multiple cortical sites, memory acquisition, hippocampus, dorsolateral prefrontal, medial prefrontal, unconscious learning, the hippocampus, incentivizing storytelling, member identification, cognitive dissonance. So it's just that the whole concept for me is that I'm a doc, I'm a science guy. I love the research being done. I'm all for whatever we can do to help our patients, to help our clients. I'm all for medication-assisted therapy and helping my alcohol patients with, acamprosate and naltrexone, and recognizing sort of, genetic precedents that increase your risk. I'm all about that, but to recognize that for me, still looking at some of the foundations of 12-step recovery and looking at that spiritual foundation, there's some pretty cool science behind the fact that those things change our brain. Those things help. And again, I'm not just talking about some specific religion, as this mentioned, whether you're talking about the other concepts of spirituality and self-awareness and mindfulness and meditation and all of those things. But 12-step recovery, that spiritual foundation that's so prominent, very much stimulates that part of our brain. I've had a couple of patients in my career that had this quote. This came from Carl Jung in his letter to Bill Wilson. You see, alcohol in Latin is spiritus, and use the same word for the highest religious experience. as well as for the most depraving poison. The helpful formula, therefore, is spiritus contra spiritum. I think if I was an alcoholic, I'd probably have that tattoo on me. Just from the dimension of spirituality and the pursuit of what that does, and how we want to help our patients. So I know I covered a lot of stuff and threw out a lot of numbers and a lot of different names. And again, I know there's different ways to approach things. But for those of you who are still either involved in your own recovery from a 12-step standpoint, or encouraging your other patients from a spiritual dimensions, I think that we definitely are on a track that has now some pretty cool science to back it up. So that's all I have. I'm happy. I know you guys need to get back to work, but I'm happy to take some questions. Christy?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Boone. So give everybody a quick chance to type in some questions if you have them into the chat box. As I mentioned before, and I did put the link out into the chat, that this webinar will be up on our website by end of day Friday, so you'll be able to access it. When you receive your survey today, because you will be getting that probably within an hour of this, please include your suggestions on topics. I so appreciate those every month. And any ideas you may have. We want to continue to grow this series, and we want to make sure we're addressing topics that y'all are interested in. So throw that in there. I look forward to reading those. And I'm guessing that there are no other questions. So that being said, Dr. Boone, thank you so much for such a great webinar. This was really informative and I enjoyed it. And we appreciate you taking the time out of your day to share this information with us.
You're so welcome. It's a pleasure. Thanks everybody for your time. Appreciate it.
You bet. On behalf of Harmony Foundation, thank you so much for your participation in our webinar series. Stay tuned for the details to come out on our March webinar, and we will see you all next month. Have a great day.